In the late 19th century, he was known as the Dean of American Letters. He wrote in a variety of genres, including but not limited to children's stories, memoirs, and history, most famously writing the campaign biography of Abraham Lincoln. He was friends with Mark Twain, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and Henry James. And he mentored younger writers such as Paul Laurence Dunbar, Sarah Orne Jewett, and Stephen Crane. Yet he is not at all well known today. I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. William Dean Howells was born in 1837 in Martinsville, Ohio, and his father was a struggling newspaper editor. Howells showed early promise as a writer, and his first poem was published when he was 15. He published prolifically, and at the age of 29 became first assistant editor and then editor of the Atlantic Monthly, a leading literary magazine of the time. This evening I'm going to read selections from two of his nonfiction works, Stories of Ohio and My Year in a Log Cabin. Let's get started. A foolish man, a philosopher, and a fanatic. Who is Blennerhassett? Asked William Wirt at the trial of Aaron Burr for treason, and many a schoolboy since has echoed that question, as many a schoolboy will hereafter, while impassioned oratory is music to the ear and witchery to the breast. The eloquent lawyer went on to answer himself and painted in glowing colors a character which history sees in a colder light. But though Blennerhassett was not the ideal that Wirt imagined, he was the generous victim of a cold and selfish man's ambition, and the ruin of his happy home and gentle hope is none the less pathetic because his own folly was partly to blame for it. We must go back of the events which we have been following to an earlier date if we wish to find Harmon Blennerhassett dwelling with his beautiful wife on their fairy island on the Ohio. Their earthly paradise lay in the larger stream at the mouth of the Kanawha, not far from the present town of Belpre, and there in the first year of the century, Blennerhassett built a mansion which became the wonder of the West. The West was not then very well able to judge of the magnificence which it celebrated, but there seems no reason to doubt that Blennerhassett's mansion was fine, and of a grandeur unexampled in that new country where most men lived in log cabins, and where any framed house was a marvel. He was of English birth, but of Irish parentage, and to the ardor of his race added the refinement of an educated taste. He was a Trinity College man, and one of his classmates at Dublin was the Irish patriot Emmet, who afterwards suffered death for his country. But it does not appear that Blennerhassett came to America for political reasons, for he seems to have made his home in the West from the impulse of a poetic nature, with the wealth and the leisure to realize the fancies of his dreams. A shrubbery that Shenstone might have envied, said Wirt, blooms around him. Music that might have charmed Calypso and her nymphs is his. An extensive library spreads its treasures before him. A philosophical apparatus offers him all the secrets and mysteries of nature. Peace, tranquility, and innocence shed their mingled delights around him. And to crown the enchantment of the scene, a wife, who is said to be lovely even beyond her sex, and graced with every accomplishment that can render it irresistible, had blessed him with her love. Whatever may be the facts concerning the home of the Blennerhassetts, the memories of those who knew its mistress bear witness to the truth of these glowing words. They testify that she was not only brilliant, accomplished, exquisite in manner, but good to everyone, kind to the poor, and devoted to her husband and children. She was a faultless housewife as well as a fearless horsewoman, and she was strong in body as she was active in mind. She could leap a 5-rail fence, walk 10 miles at a stretch, and ride with the boldest dragoon. Robed in scarlet broadcloth, with a white beaver hat, on a spirited horse, she might be seen dashing through the dark woods, reminding one of the flight and gay plumage of a tropical bird. To this home and its inmates came Aaron Burr, as bad, brave, and brilliant a man as ever figured in our public life. He had been a gallant officer in the Revolution. He had been Vice President of the United States. He had come within a vote of being president. But he had killed Alexander Hamilton in the duel which he forced upon him, and all his knowledge of the world and men had taught him to worship power and despise virtue. It has not yet been clearly shown what Burr meant or hoped to do, and possibly he could not very well have said himself, but it is certain that in a general way he was trying to separate the West from the East, and to commit the warlike people of the backwoods to a fine scheme for conquering Mexico from Spain, and setting up an imperial throne there for him to sit upon. He was always willing to sell out his fine scheme to France, to England, to any power that would buy, even to Spain itself. And in the meantime he came and went in the West and Southwest and built up a party in his favor, which fell to pieces at the first touch of real adversity. General Wilkinson of the United States Army, who had been plotting and scheming with Burr, arrested him. He was tried for treason, and those who had cast their fortunes with him were carried down in his fall. The most picturesque of the sufferers was Blennerhassett, who was one of the most innocent. Burr had found other Ohio people too plotting, as he said, but the Blennerhassetts took him seriously. And when Burr in his repeated visits tempted the husband and flattered the wife, who was ambitious only for her husband, he easily beguiled them into a belief in his glorious destiny. Blennerhassett put all his fortune into the venture. He ordered 15 large boats built for transporting 500 men down the Mississippi. He contracted for provisioning them and pledged himself for the payments of all kinds of debts. His friends tried to reason with his folly in vain. Governor Tiffin called out a company of militia to prevent his boats from leaving the Muskingum. Blennerhassett heard that he was to be arrested and fled. A troop of Virginians seized his island, pillaged his house, and ruined his grounds. And Mrs. Blennerhassett, with her children, embarked amid the ice floes of the Ohio on a small flatboat and made her way to her husband in Louisiana. Here he was taken, but discharged after a few weeks' imprisonment. They came back to their island, but they never lived there again, and in 1811 the house was burned. They wandered from place to place and grew poorer and poorer. In 1831 he died at the house of his sister in the island of Guernsey, and 7 years later his wife ended her days in a New York tenement house. Another picturesque figure of our early times was one who never meant and never imagined harm to any living creature, man or beast, but gave his simple, humble life to doing good, with no thought of his own advantage. Perhaps as the world grows more truly civilized, the name of Johnny Appleseed will be honored above that of some heroes of the Ohio country. Like so many of our distinguished men, he was not born in our state, but he came here in his young manhood from his birthplace in Massachusetts, and began at once to plant the apple seeds which gave him his nickname. Few knew that his real name was John Chapman, but it did not matter, and Johnny Appleseed became his right name if men are rightly named from their works. Wherever he went, he carried a store of apple seeds with him, and when he came to a good, clear spot on the bank of a stream, he planted his seeds, fenced the place in, and left them to sprout and grow into trees for the orchards of the neighborhood. He soon had hundreds of these little nurseries throughout Ohio, which he returned year after year to watch and tend, and which no one molested. When the trees were large enough, he sold them to the farmers for a trifle, an old coat or an old shirt, and when he needed nothing, he gave them for nothing. He went barefoot in the warm weather, and in the winter he wore cast-off shoes. When he could get none and the ways were very rough, he protected his feet with rude sandals of his own making. His hats were of his own making, too, and were usually of pasteboard with a broad brim in front to shield his eyes from the sun. But otherwise he dressed in the second-hand clothing of others, for he thought it wrong to spend upon the vanities of dress. He dwelt close to the heart of nature, whose dumb children he would not wound or kill, even poisonous snakes or noxious insects. The Indians knew him and loved him for the goodness of his life, and they honored him for the courage with which he bore the pain he would never inflict. He could drive pins into his flesh without wincing. If he got hurt, he burned the place and then treated it as a burn. He bore himself in all things, to their thinking, far above other white men. It was believed that he had come into the backwoods to forget a disappointment in love, but there's no proof that he ever suffered this. What is certain is that he was a man of beautiful qualities of heart and mind, who could at times be divinely eloquent about the work he had chosen to do in this world. He was a believer in the philosophy of Emanuel Swedenborg. He carried books of that doctrine in his bosom and constantly read them, or shared with those who cared to know it, even to tearing a volume in two. If his belief was true, and we are in this world surrounded by spirits, evil or good, which our evil or good behavior invites to be of our company, then this harmless, loving, uncouth, half-crazy man walked daily with the angels of God. In those early days when the people were poor and ignorant and had little hope of bettering themselves in this world, their thoughts turned much to the other world. The country was often swept by storms of religious excitement. At the camp meetings, the devout fell in fits and trances or were convulsed with strange throes called the jerks, and all sorts of superstitions grew up easily among them. The wildest of these, perhaps, was that of the Leatherwood god which flourished in Guernsey County about the year 1828. The name of this fanatic or impostor, who was indeed both one and the other, was Joseph C. Delks, and his title was given him because of his claim to be the supreme being, and because he first appeared to his worshippers on Leatherwood Creek at the town of Salesville. The leatherwood tree which gave this creek its name had a soft and pliable bark, which could easily be tied into knots, and was used as cordage by the pioneers. And the dwellers on Leatherwood Creek had a faith of much the same easy texture. Yet they were of rather more than the average intelligence, and they were so far from bigoted or intolerant that all sects among them worshipped in one sanctuary, a large cabin which they had built in common, and which they called the Temple. Here, on a certain night, where they sat listening to one of their preachers, they were thrilled by a loud cry of salvation, followed by a fierce snort, like that of a startled horse, and they discovered in their midst a stranger of a grave and impressive aspect, who had come no one knew whence or how. When he rose, he stood nearly 6 feet high, and showed himself of a perfect figure, with flashing black eyes, a low, broad forehead, and a fine arched nose. His hair, black and thick, fell in a mass behind his ears over his shoulders. He wore a suit of black broadcloth, a white neckcloth, and a yellow beaver hat. His weird snort and his striking presence seemed to have been the sole equipment for swaying the faith of the people, though some of the earliest believers saw a heavenly radiance streaming from his countenance at times. And when he rode, they beheld above his head a ring of light which hung in the air over the saddle if he dismounted. But he soon began to make converts, and he had quickly enough of the best among those good men and women to gain the sole use of the temple. At first, he claimed merely to be the Lord Jesus Christ, but he presently announced himself God Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, and his followers readily believed him, though he failed in the simple miracle of making a seamless garment out of a bolt of linsey woolly cloth, and kept none of his promises to them. He probably found it sufficient to be the deity, and his worshippers, among whom were 2 ministers, were certainly content, but the unbelievers felt the scandal to be too great. They had Dilks arrested and brought before two justices of the peace, who, one after the other, decided that there was no law of Ohio which forbade a man to declare himself the Almighty. The wretched creature was acquitted, but he was thoroughly frightened. He made his escape from his guards and took to the woods, where he was some time in hiding. When he came back to the believers, he had bated none of his claim to divinity, but he was no longer so bold. He now told them that the New Jerusalem would not come down at Leatherwood Creek, but in the city of Philadelphia, and he departed to the scene of his glory. 3 of the believers followed him over rugged mountains and through pathless woods, finding food and shelter by hardly less than a miracle. But they did not find the New Jerusalem at their journey's end. Dilks had told them where they should see the heavenly light the brightest. There they should behold the beginning of the New Jerusalem. But they nowhere saw this light, though they walked the streets of the earthly city night and day. 2 of them were substantial farmers, and when they had lost all hope and had lost even Dilks himself, for he soon vanished, they pledged their tobacco crops and so got money enough to come home, where they lived and died in the full faith that Joseph C. Dilks was God Almighty, though he never did anything to prove it but snort like a startled horse, wear long hair on foot and a halo on horseback, and fail in everything else he attempted. The third of this company of followers, a young minister of the United Brethren, did not return for some years. Then he came, well dressed and looking fat and sleek, and preached to the people on Leatherwood Creek the faith in which he had not faltered. He accounted for the disappearance of Dilks from the eyes of his other worshippers in Philadelphia very simply. He had seen him taken up into heaven. But the people had merely his word for the fact. Dilks never descended to earth again, as his apostle promised, and the belief in his divinity died out with those who first accepted him. The end. And now, the first few chapters of Howells' memoir, My Year in a Log Cabin. 1. In the fall of the year 1850, my father removed his family from the city of D, where we had been living, to a property on the Little Miami River to take charge of a sawmill and grist mill, and superintend their never accomplished transformation into paper mills. The property belonged to his brothers, physicians and druggists, who were to follow later when they had disposed of their business in town. My father left a disastrous newspaper enterprise behind him when he came out to apply his mechanical taste and knowledge of farming to the care of their place. Early in the century, his parents had brought him to Ohio from Wales, and his boyhood was passed in the new country, where pioneer customs and traditions were still rife. And for him, it was like renewing the wild romance of those days to take up once more the life in a log cabin interrupted by 40 years' sojourn in matter-of-fact dwellings of frame and brick. He had a passion for nature as tender and genuine and as deeply moralized as that of the English poets, by whom it had been nourished. And he taught us children all that he felt for the woods and fields and open skies. All our walks had led into them and under them. It was the fond dream of his boys to realize the trials and privations which he had painted for them in such rosy hues. And even if the only clapboarded dwelling on the property had not been occupied by the miller, we should have disdained it for the log cabin in which we took up our home until we could build a new house. Our cabin stood close upon the road, but behind it broadened a cornfield of 80 acres. They still built log cabins for dwellings in that region 40 years ago, but ours must have been nearly half a century old when we went into it. It had been recently vacated by an old Virginian couple who had long occupied it, and we decided it needed some repairs to make it habitable, even for a family inured to hardship by dauntless imaginations and accustomed to retrospective discomforts of every kind. So, before we all came out of it, a deputation of adventurers put it in what rude order they could. They glazed the narrow windows, they relaid the rotten floor, they touched, too sketchily as it afterwards appeared, the broken roof, and they papered the walls of the ground floor rooms. Perhaps it was my father's love of literature which inspired him to choose newspapers for this purpose. At any rate, he did so, and the effect, as I remember it, was not without its decorative qualities. He had used a barrel of papers bought at the nearest post office, where they had been refused by the persons to whom they had been experimentally sent by the publisher, and the whole first page was taken up by a story, which broke off in the middle of a sentence at the foot of the last column, and tantalized us forever with fruitless conjecture as to the fate of the hero and heroine. I really suppose that a cheap wallpaper could have been got for the same money, though it might not have seemed so economical. I am not sure that the use of the newspapers was not a tributary reminiscence of my father's pioneer life. I cannot remember that it excited any comment in the neighbors, who were frank with their opinions of everything else we did. But it does not greatly matter. The newspapers hid the walls and the stains with which our old Virginian predecessor, who had the habit of chewing tobacco in bed, had ineffaceably streaked the plastering near the head of the couch. The cabin, rude as it was not without its sophistications, its concessions to the spirit of modern luxury. The logs it was built of had not been left rounded as they grew, but had been squared in a sawmill, and their crevices between them had not been chinked with moss and daubed with clay in the true pioneer fashion, but had been neatly plastered with mortar, and the chimney, instead of being a structure of clay-covered bricks, was solidly laid in courses of stone. Within, however, it was all that could be asked for by the most romantic of pioneer families. It was 6 feet wide and a yard deep. Its cavernous maw would easily swallow a backlog 18 inches through, and we piled in front the sticks of hickory cord wood as high as we liked. We made a perfect trial of it when we came out to put the cabin in readiness for the family, and when the hickory had dropped into a mass of tinkling, snapping, bristling embers, we laid our rashers of bacon and our slices of steak upon them, and tasted with the appetite of tired youth the flavors of the camp and the wildwood in the captured juices. I suppose it took a day or two to put the improvements which I have mentioned upon the cabin, but I am not certain. At night we laid our mattresses on the sweet new oak plank of the floor and slept hard, in every sense. Once I remember waking and seeing the man, who was always the youngest of his boys, sitting upright on his bed. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Oh, resting," he answered, and that gave us one of the heaven-blessed laughs with which we could blow away almost any cloud of care or pain. 2. In due time the whole family took up its abode in the cabin. The household furniture had been brought out and bestowed in its scanty space. The bookcase had been set up, and the unbound books packed in easily accessible barrels. There yet remained some of our possessions to follow, chief of which was the cow, for in those simple days people kept cows in town, and it fell to me to help my father drive her out to her future home. We got on famously, talking of the wayside things so beautiful in the beautiful autumnal day, all panoplied in the savage splendor of its painted leaves, and of the poems and histories so dear to the boy who limped barefooted by his father's side, with his eye on the cow and his mind on Cervantes and Shakespeare, on the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. But the cow was very slow, far slower than the boy's thoughts, and it had fallen night and was already thick dark when we had made the 12 miles and stood under the white-limbed phantasmical sycamores beside the tail race of the grist mill, and questioned how we should get across with our charge. We did not know how deep the water was, but we knew it was very cold, and we would rather not wade it. The only thing to do seemed to be for one of us to run up under those sycamores to the sawmill, cross the head race there, and come back to receive the cow on the other side of the tail race. But the boy could not bring himself either to go or stay. I do not know just how it is with a boy's world now, but at that time it was a very dangerous world. It was full of ghosts, for one thing, and it abounded in Indians on the warpath and amateurs of kidnapping and murder of all sorts. The kind-hearted father urged, but he would not compel. You cannot well use force with a boy with whom you have been talking literature and philosophy for half a day. We could see the lights in the cabin cheerfully twinkling, and we shouted to those within, but no one heard us. We called and called in vain. Nothing but the cold rush of the tail race, the dry rustle of the sycamore leaves, and the homesick lowing of the cow replied. We determined to drive her across and pursue her with sticks and stones through the darkness beyond, and then run at the top of our speed to the sawmill and get back to take her in custody again. We carried out our part of the plan perfectly, but the cow had apparently not entered into it with intelligence or sympathy. When we reached the tail race again, she was nowhere to be found, and no appeals of "Boss" or "Suki" or "Subos" availed. She must have instantly turned again, and retraced in the darkness, which seemed to have swallowed her up, the weary steps of the day, for she was found in her old home in town the next morning. At any rate, she had abandoned the father to the conversation of the son for the time being, and the son had nothing to say. 3. I do not remember now just how it was we came by the different animals of the horse kind, as my father humorously called them, which we housed in an old log stable not far from our cabin. They must have been a temporary supply until a team worthy of our new sky blue wagon could be found. One of them was a colossal sorrel, inexorably hidebound, whose barrel, as I believe the horsemen call the body, showed every hoop upon it. He had a feeble, foolish whimper of a voice, and we nicknamed him Baby. His companion was a dun mare, who had what my father at once called an italic foot, in recognition of the emphatic slant at which she carried it when upon her unwilling travels. Then there was a small, self-opinionated gray pony, which, I think, came from one of the sawmill hands, and which was of no service conjecturable after this lapse of time. We boys rode him barebacked, and he used to draw a buggy, which he finally ran away with. I suppose we found him useful in the representation of some of the Indian fights, which we were always dramatizing, and I dare say he may have served our turn as an Arab charger, when the Moors of Granada made one of their sallies upon the camp of the Spaniards, and discharged their javelins into it. Their javelins were the long, admirably straight and slender iron weeds that grew by the river. This menagerie was constantly breaking bounds and wandering off, and I believe it was chiefly employed in hunting itself up, its different members taking turns in remaining in the pasture or stable to be ridden after those that had strayed into the woods. The origin of a large and eloquent flock of geese is lost in an equal obscurity. I recall their possession simply as an accomplished fact, and I associate their desolate cries with the windy dark of rainy November nights, so that they must at least have come into our hands after the horses. They were fenced into a clayey area next to the cabin for safekeeping, where, perpetually waddling about in majestic disoccupation, they patted the damp ground to the hardness and smoothness of a brickyard. Throughout the day they conversed tranquilly together, but by night they woke, goose after goose, to send forth a long clarion alarum, blending in a general concert at last, to assure one another of their safety. We must have intended to pluck them in the spring, but it never came to that. They stole their nests early in March, and entered upon the nurture of their young before we could prevent it, and it would then have been barbarous to pluck these mothers of families. Some of their nests we found, notably one under the spoke house, where the adventurous boy who discovered it was attacked in the dark by its owner and bitten in the nose, to the natural gratification of those who had urged him to the enterprise. But he brought away some of the eggs, and we had them fried, and I know nothing that conveys a vivider idea of inexhaustible abundance than a fried goose egg. 4. The geese were not much profit. They had to be sold finally for little or nothing, but their soft and woolly goslings were a great pleasure to all the children, who were plunged in grief when the miller's sow made a foray among them. This was a fierce and predatory animal that was in some sort a neighborhood terror. She made her lair in the reeds by this riverside, breaking out a perfect circle, which she kept against all comers, especially boys, until her young were born, and then she returned to her sty near the miller's house, convenient to the young turkeys, chickens, and goslings, leading forth her brood in a savage defiance which no one dared to front, except the miller, who did so with a shotgun at times, when her depredations became outrageous. Wherever she appeared, the children ran screaming, and the boldest boy was glad of the top rail of a fence. She was, in fact, a wild beast, but our own pigs were very social creatures. We had got some of them, I believe, from the old Virginians whom we had succeeded in the cabin, and these kept, as far as they could, the domestic habits in which that affectionate couple had indulged them. They would willingly have shared our fireside with us, humble as it was, and being repelled, they took to their quarters on the cold nights at the warm base of the chimney without, where we could hear them, as long as we kept awake, disputing the places next to the stones. All this was horrible to my mother, whose housewifely instincts were perpetually offended by the rude conditions of our life, and who justly regarded it as a return to a state which, if poetic, was also not far from barbaric. But children, and more particularly boys, take every natural thing as naturally as savages, and we never thought our pigs were other than amusing. In that country, pigs were called to their feed with long cries of "Pig, pig, pooey, pooey." But ours were taught to come at a whistle, and on hearing it, would single themselves out of the neighbor pigs, and come rushing from all quarters to the scattered corn with an intelligence that we were proud of. The end. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a very good week.